so it's day one. We just made it here in Scotland. We are at our hotel in Edinburgh. It was good to get off the flight. I hate flying, but it's good to be here. So, the doors of the past never close. There they remain, ever present, a steadfast sentinel. If one knocks, the door will be opened. If one dares, one will enter the passage of time. So this door led to the river. I would assume that the gate is new and has been put up just to protect stupid people from falling into the river. If there was not another room that was present near the castle, I would assume that this gate and this doorway existed to offer residents of the castle to have easy access to the river. This particular gate was very interesting because it was used to inspire a scene from Game of Thrones. As you can see that by the size of it and the thickness of the walls, it was very good for defense. And the inside of the gate even had a murder hole so people could shove pikes and stuff through the hole and dump flaming liquids to kill people that would be attackers and would be invaders of the castle so they could defend themselves. This room in Tantallon Castle was the East Tower, and I'm not really quite sure what it was used for, but since it offered easy access to the roof, I assume that people who came through there would be archers or other people that would defend the castle in times of crisis. This was one of my absolute favorite locations in Scotland. I'm an avid fan of Dan Brown and, of course, the Da Vinci Code. And according to Dan Brown and many other works of conspiracy theorists, Rosslyn Chapel is known to house the Holy Grail. I don't know if it houses the Holy Grail, but it was still pretty cool. You see that the doors are a lot more ornate than the castles that have previously appeared in this presentation. And I think that was so the Sinclair family could help showcase their wealth, power, and also is a holy place. So if you're making a house to God, you would want to make it nice. Speaking of houses to God, this was the Holyrood Abbey, which was near Holyrood Palace. You can see by the design of the archways over the doors that it was very intricate and it was very detailed. I think that this was to showcase the power of the people who built the church and also just to be reverent to God. Another house of God was in Iona. They recently discovered that this was a nunnery because they discovered a bunch of skeletons of only females, so they assumed that it was a nunnery. And you can see by the simplicity of the door that it was more about the humility of their faith and not about showcasing wealth or power, but it was about being humble and reverent to God. I assume that this was an archway that led to the gardens. The terrain of this area was pretty rocky and pretty hilly, but this area was very flat and it was surrounded by well-groomed trees, so I assume that this archway led to the gardens. This was the view from the kitchen at Castle Sween. As you can see, the well is really close, so those working in the kitchen would have easy access to the well. This was the side entrance to the chapel, and as you can see, it's a lot more simple and then some of the other chapels that have came before. I think that this was just to showcase its pretty austere appearance, and I don't believe that it was a chapel of a very, very wealthy person. And if it was, that's not what they put their wealth into, because it really wasn't a very elaborate chapel. This was one of the side passages in the Broch. I'm not really quite sure what it leads to. I assume that there was a room that existed at some point where people that lived in the Broch might have stored food and other items, and so this passageway just offered an easy way to get to that. This was another pretty cool castle. Unfortunately, this was where I was sick a lot, so this castle was kind of a blur, but it was really cool because it was on Loch Ness. This gate was obviously used for defense because it was very, very thick walls, and it was the gatehouse, and so it was pretty hard to penetrate. This small door led to the inside of this cottage, which is one of the only cottages like it that's still standing. And it's amazing that it's still standing because the battle that took place around it was pretty violent and it was a pretty important one. People have speculated that it might have been used as a field hospital for the British sides during the battle. Other people have speculated that it was used by Bonnie Prince Charlie as kind of a house where they met and strategized about what they were going to do in this hopeless situation. This was an entrance to one of the cairns. What it would have been used for whenever it was still intact was it was used for burials. So you would go in and then you would lay the body of the deceased on top of the ground, and it was served as kind of a tomb. This was the exit to the principal bridge at Fort George. This was a very fortified fortress. It was built in response to the rebellion that was led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, and it was a beast of a fort. Like, there was no breaking past its defenses. Considering that it was built in the 1700s, I was a bit surprised, though, that it was still an active military fort. This was the side entrance to Duffus Castle. I'm not quite sure what this was used for. Maybe it was used for visitors of the castle, but I assume that they would come through the front. Maybe it was the main entrance. I'm not really sure. Unfortunately, a lot of this castle had fallen down. It being a Mott and Bailey castle, I was pretty impressed that any of it was still standing. But as you can see, the walls are very thick, so in its prime, it was probably a pretty good, defendable castle. Here's another cathedral. As you can see, the doorway and the arches that lead to the entrance are very intricate and very designed. I think with the cathedral, it being the seat of the bishop, not only was it to show that they were willing to put in a lot of detail and a lot of effort into building the house of God, but I think it was also to show the power of the bishop of that area. This castle broke my heart because it really had the potential to be good, but it had just fallen into ruins. This front door that you entered through, I'm almost positive was not the original main entrance. Actually, I'm pretty positive. It was very small, and that's not something that you would have for just like the main entrance of your castle. And it was not very thick walls around that area, but then again, that might also be because the castle was falling down. This was a very old cathedral. Whenever you went in, you could even see the pillars buckling under the weight of the roof. So, that being said, the door was extremely intricate because it was the house of God. Again, they wanted to make something to showcase the power of the area and to show that they cared about God. But the doorway was very, very narrow, and I think that that was just due to like the weight of the ceiling. And at the time that this cathedral was built, they really hadn't figured out a way to build a building of this magnitude and have the big grandiose doors. This was one of the highlights of the trip because it was just absolutely spectacular. Seeing the sun come through there like that, it was just amazing. But one thing that I thought was really cool was that they specifically designed that the doors would be small, so that way you had to bend over to go inside it. So you had to humble yourself before you could enter. This door was built out of the scraps that the Italian prisoners of war had after working on the Churchill barriers. The people in charge of these prisoners thought that they deserved to have a place to worship, so they allowed them to build the Italian chapel with the scraps that they had left over. So even though it is beautiful, it's made out of scraps. So they literally did all that they could to make it beautiful so they could have a good place to worship. And you can tell that this tower was very easily defendable because look how thick the walls are. This castle was very old, and it was around during the time of Robert the Bruce. One of the more gruesome stories about this castle was that there was a blacksmith that assassinated I think it was the cousin of Robert the Bruce, but it really didn't work out too well for the blacksmith because he was paid in gold, but it wasn't how he intended. Edward Longshanks, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, poured molten gold down the blacksmith's throat, and after it killed him, I guess he got his money back. This hole in the ground led to a passageway which led to a big room which served as a sort of storage space that the Romans used whenever they had occupied Britain. Looking out this chapel entrance, it was pretty haunting, and I felt presence there because this was the chapel that allegedly, whenever William Wallace took the castle, he locked all the English in it and then he lit it on fire. As long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we, on any conditions, be subjected to the lordship of the English. This was one of my favorite locations. There was just so much history there. It was where they signed the Declaration of Aberystwyth, which directly impacted our Declaration of Independence. As you can see, the doors here are a little bit more fancy, and that was because it was a holy place. This particular doorway is natural because it is the entrance to a cave. It wasn't really designed by human hands at all, but what was very cool was once you entered the caves, you saw many, many, many Pictish carvings. Looking out of the Ducat, this was the view you had. As you can see, it was a pretty thin set of doors because you weren't really defending it against anything except for birds. The birds would be lured in, and then the birds would be what you would eat. The thing that I thought was very cool about this particular set of doors was how simple they were, because the Abbey was pretty grandiose, especially when you have good old Bob putting his names in big Las Vegas stone letters. But you came into the Abbey and you were greeted with these simple oak doors, or I don't know what type of wood they were, but you get the point. And it was very simple, and I thought that just the juxtaposition between the simplicity of these doors compared to just like the grandeur of the rest of the Abbey was pretty cool. This was the doorway that led to the kitchen. It was not at all as defended as the other doorways that led to the more important parts of the castle, but because I'm a nerd, what I thought was really cool about this passageway is because this is where Lancelot ran up during Monty Python and the Holy Grail, just murdering wedding guests as he went. This was a very fortified entrance. It was clear that this gate was used for defense. What really surprised me about this particular door was how thin the walls were, because this cathedral would have been massive, and just because of the sheer size of the cathedral, I would have thought that the doors would have been a bit thicker to support like the weight of the roof and other such things. This gate was clearly used for defense. The walls were just very, very thick, and the doorway was small, so if you couldn't fit a lot of people through there at once, and especially with the bridge heading to the gate, it would have been a hard castle to storm, in my opinion. this castle, this abbey.
This Abbey, dude.
This abbey.
Jacob, will you duck?
This abbey.
What's wrong?
Okay, I need you to look right there. You see that? You see that? It says William Wallace. If you look right above it, what you see is clearly not fucking Mel Gibson. This is a garbage cathedral. Shut it the fuck down. That is all.